In April 1986, the world witnessed one of the most devastating nuclear disasters in history, the explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Located in northern Ukraine, near the Belarusian border, this catastrophic event not only left the surrounding region forever scarred, but also sent shockwaves and waves of radiation across the globe. Today, the abandoned city of Pripyat and the Chernobyl exclusion zone stand as a haunting reminder of the disaster's legacy, which we'll be exploring today, along with the beautiful and unexpected ways nature has reclaimed the land. So what happened at Chernobyl? I'll be using today two National Geographical articles called The Chernobyl Disaster, What Happened and the Long-Term Impacts, and Life Goes On at Chernobyl 35 years after the world's worst nuclear accident. On April 25th and 26th, 1986, the worst nuclear accident in history unfolded in what is now northern Ukraine as a reactor at the nuclear power plant exploded and burnt. The incident was a watershed moment in both the Cold War and the history of nuclear power and was shrouded in secrecy. More than 30 years later, scientists estimate the zone around the former plant will not be habitable for up to 20,000 years. The accident at the nuclear power plant in Ukraine shocked the world, permanently altered the region, and left many questions unanswered. The Soviet Union heavily invested in nuclear power after World War II. Starting in 1977, the scientists installed 4 nuclear reactors at the power plant. Chernobyl is located in northern Ukraine, near the border with Belarus. It is part of the Kiev Oblast region, about 130 kilometers north of Ukraine's capital city, Kiev. Pripyat is a city built close to house the workers of the Chernobyl plant and is located just 3 kilometers from the reactor. Before the disaster, Pripyat was a thriving modern Soviet city, but was evacuated within 36 hours after the explosion. On April 25, 1986, routine maintenance was scheduled at the 4th reactor at Lenin's nuclear power station. Workers planned to use the downtime to test whether the reactor could still be cooled if the plant lost power. During the test, however, workers violated safety protocols and power surged inside the plant. Despite attempts to shut down the reactor entirely, another power surge caused a chain reaction of explosions inside. The nuclear core itself was exposed, spewing radioactive material into the atmosphere. Firefighters tried to put out the series of blazes at the plant, and eventually helicopters dumped sand and other materials on the fires to contain the contamination. Despite the death of 2 people in the explosion, the hospitalization of workers and firefighters, and the danger from fallout and fire, no one in the surrounding areas, including the nearby city of Pripyat, which was built in the 70s, was evacuated until about 36 hours after the disaster began. Publicising a nuclear accident was considered a significant political risk, but by then it was too late. The meltdown had already spread radiation as far as Sweden, where officials at another nuclear plant began to ask what was happening in the USSR. After first denying any accident, the Soviets finally made a brief announcement on April 28th. Soon the world realised that it was witnessing a historic event. Up to 30% of Chernobyl's 190 metric tons of uranium was now in the atmosphere, and the Soviet Union eventually evacuated 335,000 people, establishing a 90-mile wide exclusion zone around the reactor. The fallout included iodine-131, cesium-137 and plutonium-239, none of which occur naturally and all of which are extremely dangerous for humans and other animals. Each substance decays on its own schedule called a half-life, which is the amount of time it takes to halve its radioactivity. For iodine-131, which quickly accumulates in the thyroid gland and causes thyroid cancer, that half-life is 8 days. For cesium-137, which persists in the soil and produces gamma rays that have hundreds of thousands of times more energy than rays of sunlight, the half-life is around 30 years. Plutonium-239 is extremely radiotoxic when inhaled and has the half-life of 24,000 years. Though the main pattern of radioactive fallout, which is blotchy and unpredictable, was established soon after the accident, radioactive particles remain on the move to this day, still shifting in the wind and flowing through the water. At least 28 people initially died as a result of the accident, while more than 100 were injured. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation have reported that more than 6,000 children and adolescents developed thyroid cancer after being exposed to radiation from the incident, although some experts have challenged this claim. International researchers have predicted that ultimately around 4,000 people exposed to high levels of radiation could succumb to radiation-related cancer, whilst about 5,000 people exposed to lower levels of radiation may suffer the same fate. The full consequences of the accident, including many impacts on mental health and even subsequent generations, remain highly debated and under study. The reason I wanted to create this video is to explore the haunting images of the abandoned city of Pripyat and the incredible and interesting ways nature has grown back. The cleanup effort was officially called the liquidation of the consequences of the Chernobyl accident, and the workers were called liquidators. They had an impossible job. Radioactive particles are invisible and have no taste or smell. Yet, in the hotspots, they contaminate everything, from bricks to livestock to the leaves on the ground. These particles cannot be destroyed. All the liquidators can do was to inter them or try to seal them up in some way. Some worked around the villages, bulldozing crops, cutting down forest, and even burrowing the top layer of the earth itself. Around the nuclear power plant, some jobs, like lifting highly radioactive debris or pouring concrete to seal the reactor, were so dangerous that men would absorb lethal doses of radiation in minutes. National Geographic describes a small group of resettlers who have permission from the Ukrainian government to live in the zone full-time. It's cozy inside their little brick house. People like them have occupied abandoned houses over the years and fixed them up. There are plenty to choose from. The town of Chernobyl used to have a population of 14,000. In the living room, they have houseplants, by the window, some comfy chairs and a TV, and a glowing aquarium full of lively fish. They admit that living in Chernobyl is risky and troublesome, especially because children are forbidden. They each have children before they met, but because anyone under 18 is more susceptible to ionizing radiation, there is a couple who have lived there for 30 years, and now they're in their 60s and retired. They don't plan on going anywhere. When asked why, Lahipa thinks for a minute and then replies, "I'm just happy in Chernobyl." Those who flouted the evacuation order and returned to their home villages after the accident are now in their late 70s and early 80s, and many have died in the last 5 years. Those who remain rely on food from their gardens and the surrounding forest, including large and abundant mushrooms that are especially good at absorbing cesium-137, which emits both beta and gamma radiation. Some residents roast these mushrooms inside their homes with wood-burning ovens. The trees they burn for fuel could also be radioactive, so the smoke causes new mini fallouts nearby. There have been some incredibly important studies on the effects of the explosion on the local ecosystem, from the soils to the trees, invertebrates, birds and mammals. Scientists can't quite agree if the wildlife is now thriving or if there's been a decline in health and the abundance of local creatures. According to David Copplestone, a radioecologist at the University of Stirling, there is a grain of truth in all of these studies. The question is with interpretation. At the heart of this debate is not so much whether chronic radiation has any effect on living things, but at what dose the effects become significant. Radiation levels around Chernobyl have plummeted since the initial accident, but creatures that have the space have been exposed to low levels on a chronic basis. The numbers of some wildlife, from lynxes to elk, have increased. However, scientists have found elevated levels of catarrhs and albinism, and lower levels of beneficial bacteria. In the immediate aftermath of the accident, an area about 4 square miles of pine trees became known as the Red Forest because so many trees turned reddish-brown and died after absorbing high levels of radiation. As time has passed, the most dangerous radionuclides, the zone became less inhospitable. The radionuclide iodine-131, for example, vanished by the summer of 1986, leaving slower decaying ones like cesium-137 and strontium-90 scattered unevenly within the soils, vegetation, fungi and animals. There was also an economic and political toll of Chernobyl, which hastened the end of the USSR and fueled the global anti-nuclear movement. The disaster has been estimated to cost some $235 billion in damages. What is now Belarus, which saw 23% of its territory contaminated by the accident, lost about a fifth of its agricultural land. At the height of the disaster response efforts in 1991, Belarus spent 22% of its total budget dealing with Chernobyl. So that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed seeing these fascinating pictures. I want to credit almost entirely to National Geographic articles, which I have basically read back to you because I have the creativity of a teaspoon when putting this episode together. It's just one of those days. Nonetheless, please give us a like if you liked it, and please hit subscribe. I put out new episodes every Tuesday, and I hope you're having a fabulous spooky season, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.